She had nowhere left to run. No family waiting for her. No money. No place in the world that wanted her. That night, 17-year-old Isabella ran through the dark streets with a torn backpack clutched tightly against her chest. Behind her, voices shouted. Not because anyone cared about her. Because they wanted to catch her. The orphanage she escaped from wasn't searching for a lost child. They were hunting a witness. Isabella had seen something she was never supposed to see. And now the people who ran that place would do anything to bring her back. She kept running until the cold city lights replaced the darkness of the highway. Cars passed. People walked by. But no one stopped for the thin girl with trembling hands and tired eyes. To them, she was just another street child. Another problem. Another life that didn't matter. By morning, hunger twisted painfully inside her stomach. She hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. She wandered through crowded streets, hoping someone might offer work. Anything. Cleaning. Carrying boxes. Washing dishes. But every shop turned her away. Some didn't even look at her. Others stared at her worn shoes and closed their doors before she could speak. By afternoon, Isabella had reached a district unlike anything she had ever seen. Luxury cars. Tall buildings. Men in dark suits speaking into phones. Power lived here. And without realizing it, Isabella had just walked into the territory of the most feared man in the city. Lorenzo Ricci. People whispered his name carefully. Some said he controlled half the city's underground world. Others said even powerful politicians avoided crossing him. But Isabella didn't know any of that. She only knew she was hungry. And very tired. As she passed a black luxury car parked near a private restaurant entrance, something unexpected happened. The car door opened suddenly. A group of sharply dressed men stepped out. And before Isabella could move away, one of them grabbed her arm. "Hey," the man snapped. "What do you think you're doing here?" She froze. Fear rushed through her chest. I'm sorry," she whispered quickly. "I was just passing." The men looked at her suspiciously. A dirty backpack. Tired eyes. A runaway girl standing near an expensive car. To them the answer was obvious. "A pickpocket," one of them muttered. "Throw her out." They pushed her back toward the street. Isabella stumbled, nearly falling. Her heart pounded as humiliation burned inside her chest. She turned to leave quickly. Just like every other place in the city. This one didn't want her either. But inside the restaurant doorway, someone had been watching everything. A tall man dressed in a dark coat stood quietly in the shadows. His expression was calm. Unreadable. Lorenzo Ricci. The men beside him were already turning away when he suddenly spoke. His voice was quiet. But it carried authority that froze everyone instantly. "Wait." The guards stopped. Lorenzo's eyes followed the small figure walking away down the street. The frightened girl with the torn backpack. Something about her didn't match what his men believed. After a moment he gave a simple order. "Bring that girl back." None of them knew it yet. But that one decision would start a war that powerful people in the city had spent years trying to hide. And the runaway orphan they tried to chase away was about to change everything. For as long as Isabella could remember, nights in the orphanage were the worst. The building looked harmless from the outside. An old gray structure with narrow windows and a rusted gate. People in the city believed it was a place where abandoned children were protected. But inside it was something else. The halls always smelled of bleach and cold metal. The lights flickered even during the day. And the silence carried a strange kind of tension, as if everyone inside was holding their breath. The children rarely laughed. They spoke in whispers. 'Cause the director hated noise. His name was Mr. Calder, and the moment his heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, every child froze. If someone talked too loudly, they were punished. If someone cried at night, they were punished. If someone asked questions, the punishment was worse. Isabella learned very quickly that survival meant staying invisible. She was 17, older than most of the other children, and that made her useful. She cleaned floors, carried heavy boxes, washed dishes in the kitchen until her fingers wrinkled and cracked. But even then, something about the place always felt wrong. Sometimes late at night, unfamiliar cars would arrive outside the gate. Men in expensive coats would walk inside the director's office. And sometimes, a child would disappear the next day. The director always had the same explanation. "They were adopted," he would say with a smile that never reached his eyes. But Isabella noticed something strange. No one ever came to say goodbye. No letters were sent. No photos ever returned. It was as if those children had never existed. The truth revealed itself on a stormy night. The rain was pounding against the windows when Isabella was sent to deliver a stack of files to the director's office. The door was slightly open. Inside, two men were speaking in low voices. "The buyers will arrive tomorrow," one of them said. "Make sure the older ones are ready." Isabella froze. Her heart began to pound loudly in her chest. Buyers. She carefully leaned closer to the door. Then she saw something on the desk. A large black ledger filled with names, ages, and prices. Her stomach turned. These weren't adoption records. They were selling children. Suddenly a chair scraped loudly inside the room. Isabella stepped back quickly, panic rushing through her body. If they saw her, if they knew she had heard. She didn't wait to think. Ran. Down the hallway. Past the sleeping rooms. Past the kitchen. Her heart pounded as thunder shook the building. Behind her, a door slammed open. "Hey!" someone shouted. Footsteps followed. Fast. Angry. Isabella burst through the back door into the cold rain. The storm hit her face as she ran across the muddy yard toward the tall metal gate. Her hands shook as she struggled with the rusted lock. For a terrifying moment, it wouldn't move. Click. The gate swung open. Isabella didn't look back. She ran into the darkness beyond the orphanage walls, the rain soaking her clothes as fear pushed her forward. For the first time in years she was free. But freedom came with a terrifying truth. The people she escaped from would never let her go. And somewhere in the distance, sirens began to echo through the night. By the time the storm faded behind her, Isabella had already walked for hours. The road stretched endlessly under pale streetlights, and the muddy path from the orphanage slowly turned into cracked pavement. Cars rushed past without slowing, their headlights briefly lighting her tired face before disappearing into the darkness again. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She only knew one thing. She could never go back. Her clothes were still damp from the rain, clinging uncomfortably to her thin frame. The torn backpack on her shoulder held the only thing she owned: a small notebook, an old photograph, and a piece of bread she had hidden from dinner 2 nights before. She finished the last bite sometime before sunrise. After that, there was nothing. By morning, the quiet highway turned into busy city streets. Tall buildings rose around her like walls of glass and steel. The air smelled different here. Exhaust fumes, street food, and the sharp scent of coffee drifting from cafes she could not afford to enter. People moved quickly through the sidewalks, dressed in clean clothes, holding phones and bags and briefcases. No one noticed the thin girl walking slowly along the edge of the crowd. At first, Isabella tried to be hopeful. She stepped toward a small grocery store where a man was stacking crates outside. "Sir, do you need help carrying anything?" she asked softly. The man barely glanced at her. "No." She nodded quickly and walked away. At the next shop she tried again. "I can clean, or wash dishes." The woman behind the counter shook her head without even letting Isabella finish. "No jobs here." A few people looked at her suspiciously. Others ignored her completely. By afternoon, her legs were aching and her stomach felt hollow. She stopped near a small park bench and sat down carefully, pressing her hands against her stomach as it growled painfully. For a moment, she wondered if escaping had been a mistake. At least the orphanage had food, even if it came with fear. But the thought of those voices in the director's office, the ledger filled with children's names and prices, made her shake her head quickly. Well, she would rather starve than go back. As the sun lowered toward evening, Isabella wandered into a part of the city unlike the crowded streets she had passed earlier. The sidewalks were wider here. The buildings were taller. Luxury cars lined the streets, their polished surfaces reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Men in dark suits stood near expensive restaurants, speaking quietly into phones. Something about the atmosphere felt different. Quieter. Heavier. Isabella didn't realize it, but she had just stepped into the district everyone in the city knew about, but rarely spoke of. This was Lorenzo Ricci's territory. The place where deals were made behind closed doors. Where powerful people came when they needed problems handled quietly. Isabella only saw something else. A restaurant entrance. Warm lights glowing through large windows. And the faint smell of food drifting through the evening air. Her stomach twisted painfully again. She stepped a little closer without thinking, drawn by the warmth and the scent of fresh bread. But the moment she reached the edge of the entrance driveway, a black luxury car rolled slowly to a stop beside her. The door opened. Men in dark coats stepped out first. Their eyes immediately locked onto her. And suddenly, the quiet street didn't feel welcoming at all. One of the men stepped forward immediately. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark coat perfectly pressed, his expression sharp with suspicion. His eyes swept over Isabella quickly, the torn backpack, the thin frame, the tired face that clearly didn't belong in this part of the city. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly. Isabella froze. Up close, the men looked even more intimidating than they had from a distance. Everything about them felt controlled, serious, dangerous. I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to bother anyone." Another guard glanced toward the luxury car, then back at her. "Move along," he said. "This isn't a place for street kids." "I was just passing," Isabella whispered. But the first man had already made up his mind. People like her didn't wander into streets like this by accident. "She's scouting," he muttered to the others. "Pickpockets sometimes do that." Before she could react, he grabbed her arm and pushed her away from the car. "Go," he snapped. The force made Isabella stumble backward. Her heart pounded as shame burned through her chest. "I wasn't trying to steal anything," she said quickly. But the men had already turned their attention back to the car. To them, she was nothing more than a nuisance. Someone to push away before the real business began. Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped back onto the sidewalk. She didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. So she walked, past the glowing restaurant windows, past the line of expensive cars, past the men who had already forgotten she existed. Her shoulders trembled slightly as she disappeared down the street. What she didn't know was that someone else had been watching the entire moment. From the restaurant entrance, a tall man stood quietly near the doorway. He hadn't said a word while the guards handled the situation, but his sharp eyes followed the girl as she walked away. Lorenzo Ricci rarely paid attention to strangers, especially not a frightened girl in worn clothes. But something about her had caught his attention. It wasn't the way she looked. It was the way she reacted. No shouting, no begging, no anger, just quiet fear and quiet pride. As if she had already learned not to expect kindness from anyone. Beside him, one of his men spoke casually. "Just another runaway," the guard said with a shrug. "Probably trying to steal something." Lorenzo didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the small figure moving farther down the street. There was something else too. When the guard pushed her, she hadn't fought back. But for a brief moment, her eyes had flashed with something deeper than fear. The look of someone running from something far worse than hunger. Lorenzo finally spoke. "Who is she?" The guard blinked in surprise. "No idea, boss. Just some street girl." Lorenzo watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then he gave a quiet order. "Find out." The men looked at each other. "You want us to check on her?" "Yes." His voice remained calm. "Find her." The guard nodded quickly and stepped away to make a call. Within minutes, Two men slipped quietly into the evening crowd, moving down the street in the direction Isabella had gone. Lorenzo turned toward the restaurant entrance again. But his thoughts remained on the girl who had just walked away. He had seen fear before. He had seen desperation. But the look in her eyes had been something different. And Lorenzo Ricci trusted his instincts. If a frightened girl had wandered into his territory carrying that kind of fear, then somewhere in the city, someone was hunting her. Isabella had walked several blocks before the quiet street behind her slowly disappeared into the noise of the city again. The glow of the luxury district faded, replaced by dim streetlights and narrow sidewalks. Her legs ached from hours of walking, and the cold evening air slipped through the thin fabric of her clothes. She told herself not to stop. Not yet. If she stopped, the hunger would feel worse. If she stopped, the memories might catch up with her. But her body was already slowing down. She reached a small alley between two closed shops and leaned lightly against the brick wall, trying to steady her breathing. The city buzzed somewhere beyond the corner, but the alley itself was quiet. Too quiet. Footsteps suddenly echoed from the entrance. Isabella stiffened. Two men stepped into the narrow space. The same men from the black car. Her heart jumped violently. For a second she thought the orphanage had found her already. She pushed herself away from the wall quickly. "I didn't take anything," she said before they could speak. The taller one raised a hand slightly. "Relax," he said. "No one said you stole anything." But Isabella's instincts screamed danger. People who spoke calmly were often the most dangerous ones. "What do you want?" she asked cautiously. "Our boss wants to see you." The words made her stomach twist. She knew what that meant. "No," she said quickly. The men exchanged a brief look. "You should come with us." I said no. Her voice shook, but she stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere." She had escaped one place that controlled her life. She wasn't stepping into another. The shorter man sighed quietly. "Look," he said. "You wandered into the wrong street earlier tonight. Our boss noticed." "I didn't do anything," Isabella insisted. "We know." "Then leave me alone." For a moment none of them spoke. The taller guard studied her face carefully. Fear was there. But beneath it was stubborn determination. Finally he spoke again, more gently this time. "He just wants to talk." Isabella shook her head. "I don't trust people who send men to drag strangers into cars." The men looked slightly amused. "No one's dragging you anywhere," the guard said. But Isabella was already backing away. "If he wants to talk," she said quietly, "tell him to find someone else." She turned and started walking quickly toward the street. The guards didn't stop her. Not this time. But they followed from a distance. A few minutes later, Isabella reached the end of the block. Black car waited there. She stopped. The door opened slowly. Tall man stepped out. He moved with calm confidence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Even before he spoke, Isabella knew who he was. The man from the restaurant. Lorenzo Ricci. The guards stepped back respectfully. Lorenzo's eyes rested on her for a long moment. Not harsh. Not angry. Just observant. "You run very quickly," he said calmly. Isabella crossed her arms defensively. "I've had practice." A faint trace of amusement touched his expression. "I can see that." Neither of them moved. The streetlight above cast a pale glow over the quiet scene. Finally Lorenzo spoke again. "Who are you running from?" Isabella didn't answer his question. For a moment she simply stood there under the pale streetlight, her arms still crossed, her eyes fixed on the ground as if the pavement were safer to look at than the man in front of her. Lorenzo Ricci waited. He was used to silence. In his world, people often spoke too quickly when they were afraid. But the girl in front of him did the opposite. She closed herself off completely. Finally she said quietly, "No one." Lorenzo tilted his head slightly. "That's not true." She didn't look up. People don't run through the city at night with nothing but a backpack unless someone is chasing them. The words hung in the air between them. Isabella's fingers tightened slightly around the straps of her bag. "I told you," she said softly. "I'm not in trouble. Maybe not with the police." His tone remained calm. "But someone is hunting you." That word made her eyes flicker. Just for a moment, Lorenzo noticed. He always noticed the smallest details. "Go home," she said quickly. "I didn't ask for help." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked past him. This time Lorenzo didn't stop her. He simply watched as she disappeared down the dim street again, her small figure fading into the darkness. Only after she was gone did he speak. "Find out where she came from." One of his men stepped forward immediately. "Yes, boss." Within hours, the quiet machinery of Lorenzo Ricci's network began moving. The city was large, but his reach was larger. People asked questions. Records were checked. Names were mentioned carefully. By the following evening, the answers began to return. Lorenzo sat in his private office above the restaurant, the city lights glowing through the tall windows behind him. One of his trusted men placed a thin folder on the desk. "We found something," he said. Lorenzo opened it slowly. Inside were several printed reports and photographs. At the top of the first page was the name of an orphanage. St. Brigid's Children's Home. A small institution on the edge of the city. At first glance, it looked ordinary. But the deeper the reports went, the stranger the details became. Over the past 5 years, dozens of children had been listed as adopted. Yet there were no adoption records filed with the city. No paperwork. No follow-up reports. Just names that quietly disappeared. Lorenzo flipped to the next page. Another report. Another list of missing children. His expression darkened slightly. "Anything else?" he asked. The man hesitated before answering. "We spoke to someone who used to work there. And he said expensive cars visit the orphanage late at night." Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. "What kind of cars?" "Luxury ones." The man lowered his voice slightly. "The kind that belong to very powerful people." Silence settled over the room. Lorenzo closed the folder slowly. Now the fear in the girl's eyes made sense. She hadn't been running from poverty. She had been running from something far worse. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the glowing city below. "Send 2 men," he said quietly. "To the orphanage." "No." His voice hardened slightly. "Find the girl." Behind him, the folder lay open on the desk, the list of missing children visible beneath the office light. And somewhere in the city, the only witness who had escaped that place was still walking the streets alone. That night, the city felt colder than usual. Isabella walked slowly along the dim sidewalks, her shoulders hunched against the wind. The streets were quieter now, most shops already closed, their windows dark except for the occasional flicker of neon signs in the distance. Her feet hurt. Her stomach still twisted with hunger. But it wasn't the hunger that troubled her most. It was the memory she kept trying to push away. The office. The storm. The ledger. She had tried not to think about it since she escaped. Thinking about it only made the fear worse. But now, with nowhere to sleep and nothing to distract her thoughts, the memory returned clearly. Too clearly. She remembered the director's office door slightly open, the voices inside, and the book. It had been sitting on the desk, thick, black, heavy. First she thought it was just paperwork. But when she looked closer, she saw something that made her stomach turn. Dozens of them. Each written carefully in neat rows. Next to every name was an age. And beside the age, a number. At the time, she hadn't understood what the numbers meant. But she understood now. They were prices. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she walked. Some of the names were children she knew. A boy named Matteo who used to draw pictures on the walls with chalk. A quiet girl named Lila who cried every night after lights out. Both of them had left for adoption. Neither had ever come back. Isabella swallowed hard. Below the names were other notes. Short comments written in careful handwriting. Healthy. Quiet. Obedient. The words made her feel sick. And at the bottom of the page was something else. Names that didn't belong to children. They were written in a different column. Adult. Beside them were short descriptions. Client confirmed. Payment received. She hadn't understood everything she saw that night. But she understood enough. Someone was buying those children. And the orphanage was selling them. A sudden car horn nearby made her jump slightly. Isabella shook the memory away and kept walking. But the images refused to leave her mind. There was one page she remembered more clearly than the others. The last page she saw before the chair scraped in the office behind her. That page had names she recognized. Not from the orphanage. From the city. She had seen those names on billboards. On television screens in store windows. Important people. Wealthy people. Powerful people. At the time she thought maybe she had read it wrong. But now she knew she hadn't. Those people were connected to the orphanage. Which meant something far more dangerous than she first realized. Isabella stopped walking. Her chest tightened as the truth settled into place. If the orphanage realized she had seen that ledger, then they wouldn't just want to bring her back. They would want to silence her. Forever. Across the city, inside his office, Lorenzo Ricci sat quietly reviewing the reports his men had gathered. The folder about the orphanage remained open on his desk. Something about the situation still felt incomplete. Then one of his men stepped into the room. "We found the girl," he said. Lorenzo looked up slowly. "Where?" "Still in the city." The man hesitated before adding one more detail. "She looks like she's remembering something." Lorenzo leaned back slightly in his chair. His instincts had been right. The girl wasn't just running from the orphanage. She was carrying something with her. Something dangerous. And whatever it was, powerful people would kill to keep it hidden. The night had grown quieter, but Isabella felt anything but safe. She had found a narrow corner between two closed storefronts and sat there for a while, hugging her knees to her chest. The pavement beneath her was cold, and the wind slipped through the empty street like a warning. She tried to calm her thoughts, but the memory of the ledger kept returning. Prices. Powerful people. The realization made her chest tighten. If the orphanage discovered she had seen those pages, they would never allow her to live freely. She wasn't just a runaway anymore. She was a witness. A sound of tires rolling slowly over the road made her look up. A dark van turned the corner at the end of the street. Moved too slowly. Too deliberately. Isabella's instincts sharpened instantly. The van stopped near the sidewalk. For a moment nothing happened. Then the side door slid open. Two men stepped out. They weren't dressed like the men from Lorenzo's restaurant. These men looked rough. Heavy jackets. Hard eyes. One of them scanned the street until his gaze landed directly on her. "There she is," he muttered. Cold fear shot through Isabella's body. She stood up immediately. Her heart began pounding again. The second man stepped forward with a thin smile. "Been looking for you," he said. Isabella backed away slowly. "I don't know you." The man laughed quietly. "Doesn't matter." Behind him, the other man closed the van door. The street suddenly felt very small. "Come with us," the first man said. His voice wasn't a request. Isabella's hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm not going anywhere." The man's smile disappeared. "You really think this is a choice?" Isabella turned suddenly and ran. Her shoes slapped against the pavement as she sprinted down the street. Behind her, footsteps exploded into motion. "Grab her!" The shout echoed through the empty road. She ran past dark storefronts and empty benches, her lungs burning as panic pushed her forward. A hand suddenly grabbed the strap of her backpack. The force yanked her backward. She fell hard against the pavement. Pain shot through her arm. Before she could scramble away, one of the men grabbed her wrist tightly. "Enough running," he growled. She struggled, kicking and twisting desperately. "Let me go." The man tightened his grip. "You should have stayed where you belonged." His partner reached for the van. Just get her inside. Headlights suddenly swept across the street. Car turned the corner sharply. Bright beams flooded the scene. The men froze. A black car rolled to a stop beside them. The engine went quiet. The door opened slowly. A tall figure stepped out. The men recognized him immediately. Their confidence vanished. Lorenzo Ricci walked forward calmly, his coat moving slightly in the night wind. His eyes settled on Isabella first, then on the man holding her arm. His voice was quiet. Let her go. For a moment no one moved. Then the man released her wrist quickly. Isabella stumbled back, breathing hard. The two criminals exchanged nervous looks. Everyone in the city knew Lorenzo's name. Crossing him was never a good idea. One of them tried to laugh awkwardly. Just a misunderstanding. Lorenzo's expression didn't change. I don't like misunderstandings, he said softly. The street fell silent again. And for the first time since she escaped the orphanage, Isabella realized something strange. The men who had been chasing her were suddenly afraid. The two men backed away slowly. Neither of them looked at Isabella anymore. Their attention remained fixed on Lorenzo Ricci, whose calm presence seemed heavier than the night itself. One of them forced a nervous smile. Boss, we didn't know she belonged to you. Lorenzo's gaze didn't soften. She doesn't belong to anyone. The man nodded quickly, stepping backward toward the van. Of course. Just a misunderstanding. Lorenzo said nothing. But the silence between them carried a warning stronger than any threat. Within seconds the men climbed back into the van. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle sped away down the street without another word. The moment it disappeared, Lorenzo turned his attention back to Isabella. She was still breathing heavily, rubbing the wrist the man had grabbed. You see, he said quietly. You are being chased. Isabella didn't answer. But the fear in her eyes had changed. It was no longer just fear of him. It was fear of the truth. Lorenzo studied her for a moment. Who sent them? She hesitated. Then slowly she spoke. The orphanage. The word hung in the air. Lorenzo nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already suspected. You saw something there. It wasn't a question. Isabella looked down at the ground. There's a book, she whispered. A ledger. His expression sharpened slightly. What kind of ledger? Her voice trembled. Names, ages, prices. Silence filled the street. Behind Lorenzo, one of his men shifted slightly. Even they understood what those words meant. Lorenzo spoke calmly again. Where is it? In the director's office. He nodded once. That was all he needed. Within an hour, several black cars moved quietly through the dark roads outside the city. The orphanage stood exactly where the report described, an old building surrounded by rusted fencing and tall trees. From a distance it looked peaceful. Inside the lights were still on. Lorenzo stepped out of the car. His men moved with quiet precision, spreading around the building. A moment later the front doors burst open. The director barely had time to stand before Lorenzo walked into the office. The man's face turned pale instantly. Mr. Ricci, this is unexpected. Lorenzo placed the black ledger on the desk. They had already found it. The director's voice faltered. I can explain. You will, Lorenzo replied calmly. Behind them, his men were already opening locked rooms throughout the building. Small frightened faces peeked out from the darkness. Children who had been told they were waiting for adoption. Children who had never left. One by one the doors opened. The truth spread quickly through the building. In the office, the director's hands trembled as Lorenzo flipped open the ledger. Ages, prices. And beside them, the names of powerful buyers. Lorenzo closed the book slowly. You were selling them, he said. The director collapsed into the chair, unable to speak. Outside, the sound of police sirens began to grow louder. Lorenzo had already made the call. Minutes later, officers flooded the building. The children were led outside into the night air. For the first time in years, the gates of the orphanage opened not to hide secrets, but to set them free. Across the yard, Isabella stood quietly beside Lorenzo's car, watching the children step into safety. For the first time since the night she ran away, the place she feared most was finally finished. By morning, the orphanage was no longer a place of secrets. Police cars filled the road outside the old gates. Officers moved in and out of the building carrying boxes of documents and evidence. The rusted sign that once read St. Bridget's Children's Home hung crookedly, its meaning finally exposed. For years people had believed it was a shelter. Now the truth had been uncovered. Inside the yard, children sat wrapped in warm blankets provided by social workers and medical teams. Some looked confused, others frightened. A few simply stared at the open sky as if they had forgotten what freedom looked like. Isabella stood quietly near the edge of the gate. The cold morning air brushed against her face, but she hardly noticed it. Her eyes moved slowly across the yard. She recognized many of the children. Matteo sat on the back of an ambulance with a cup of hot tea in his hands. Lila was speaking softly with a woman from Child Services, her thin shoulders no longer shaking with fear. For the first time no one was shouting at them. No one was locking doors. No one was making them disappear. A strange feeling settled in Isabella's chest. Relief. But also something deeper. She had escaped that place believing she was alone. Yet somehow, her escape had led to all of this. Footsteps approached beside her. Lorenzo Ricci stopped near the gate, watching the scene quietly. He looked exactly the same as he had the night before. Calm, composed, distant. But Isabella knew something now that she hadn't known then. Without him, none of this would have happened. "They'll close the building today," he said. His voice was calm, almost casual. "The authorities will move the children to proper care centers." Isabella nodded slowly. "That's good." They stood in silence for a moment. The rising sun cast soft light over the yard, turning the cold morning air warmer. Lorenzo finally looked down at her. "What will you do now?" The question made her pause. For so long, her only goal had been to escape. She had never thought about what came after. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Lorenzo reached into the inside pocket of his coat and handed her a small envelope. She opened it carefully. Inside was a card with the name of a private school and a short note. "Full scholarship approved." Her eyes widened. "You can start over," Lorenzo said simply. "No orphanage. No running." For a moment she couldn't speak. Her fingers tightened around the paper. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked softly. Lorenzo's gaze moved back toward the orphanage building one last time. "Because someone had to." He turned toward the waiting car. The driver opened the door quietly. Within seconds Lorenzo Ricci was gone, the black car disappearing down the road as silently as it had arrived. He didn't look back. But Isabella did. She watched the road for a long moment. Then she looked down at the envelope in her hands. For the first time in her life, the future wasn't something to fear. It was something waiting for her. And the girl who once ran through the night with nothing but a torn backpack finally had somewhere she belonged.